Hello. So, if you need closed captions, then I would just like to invite you to please click on the CC button that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And during this event, please post any questions in the Q&A. We have Norma kindly providing closed captions for us tonight, and Nicola and Claire will be providing BSL. So big thank you. So a warm welcome to everyone here tonight, members, supporters, and friends of Sisters of Frida. My name's Tumu, and I'm going to give you a visual description. So I'm a Black mixed cisgender woman wearing a knitted black jumper with a patterned collar and pink dangly earrings. And I just invite everyone that's comfortable to do so to also share a description when speaking and showing their video this evening. So we are so excited to welcome you tonight for the launch of our report, which aims to lift and amplify the voices of disabled women and spotlight our perspectives and experiences on independent living during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are Sisters of Frida, an experimental collective of intersectional disabled feminists. Founded in 2014, we strive to build networks of disabled women, share experiences, and explore intersectional possibilities in pursuit of our liberation. We are inclusive of all self-identifying women and girls, non-binary and gender-conforming disabled people. As a collective, we do not claim to speak for all disabled women. We value the rich tapestry of different disabled experiences, and we seek to lift our voices wherever we can. So tonight, we'll share with you the findings of our report. We have some brilliant panellists who I will introduce in a minute, and they're going to share their reflections on our findings. And we're then going to open the floor for a Q&A. We then have the pleasure of a performance from the brilliant Dennis Queen before spending some time together, looking to the future and discussing and imagining what next steps might emerge from this work. So firstly, I'd like to introduce briefly some of our panellists who you'll get to meet properly a bit later on. So firstly, MSunnia is a queer crip feminist and was the researcher on this project. So they'll introduce the research to you shortly. We have Rachel O'Brien, who is a member of Sisters of Frida. She's on the steering group, and her day job is in public affairs for disabled people and campaigning on disabled rights. Unfortunately, Martha can't join us this evening, so we're just sending good vibes to Martha, and she'll definitely be missed. Dennis Queen is a queer disabled musician based in Manchester and has been involved in the disabled people's movement for over 20 years. And like I said, my name's Tumu. I'm a steering group member at Sisters of Frida and a trainee clinical psychologist. So for the purposes of access, I'm just going to let you know that we'll be having a comfort break at 7:20, and I will try my very, very best to hold us to that time. So I'd like to first start by introducing MSunnia, who is going to share a bit more about the report and introduce you to some of the work that's been done.
Thanks, Tumu. Hi, I'm the researcher on the project, and I am a South Asian person with short black hair, and behind me is half of is my wall in my living room and half of a pride flag at the back of the back, and I am wearing a purple cardigan on a brown dress. So I'm the researcher on the project, and as a disabled person, I'd like to say that this pandemic has made me very furious and extremely worried at the state of intersectional ableism and other inequalities in the UK. So as a queer person of colour with my own issues on health, housing and employment, I have been extremely worried and experienced marginalisation. So doing this research and speaking to those who have been in a similar position has meant a lot. We spoke with 11 disabled women and non-binary folks on how access, inclusion and independent living have been for them since the pandemic began. The report brings together some overarching themes that came from our participants. Some have been around finances, so loss of employment, disability discrimination, and importantly, issues to do with the benefits system. Our participants have also struggled greatly with social care. So, for example, some had zero PA support, which meant that they struggled to live, to eat, to exist in a clean place, and to look after themselves properly. Okay, there's feedback, so if could somebody mute themselves. Yeah.
Everybody thought that.
Bethany, oh, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So some of our participants really struggled. Some of them struggled with accessing food, medicine, and basic items. Some relied on food banks. So the mental health of our participants have been at a detriment. And this is also backed up by statistics from the Office for National Statistics. The mental health deterioration is as a result of the systemic violence that disabled women have faced during the pandemic. So these violences are gendered labor, financial concerns, health worries, their inability to leave the house, their inability to get basic household products, and this affected their impairments as well. So we know that disabled people also are more likely to suffer from mental health distress, and this is due to the ableism that we face on a daily basis. So the picture is bleak because there is an overall systemic breakdown across society on pretty much all aspects relating to supporting disabled women, from social care to pay in the workplace. So this is a structural issue, and it is about policy. It is about local authorities, the NHS, education, and other providers simply not delivering equitable services for disabled women. So we need to ask ourselves why, and we need to look at what is creating these problems. In terms of social attitudes and culture, our participants reported that some non-disabled people adhered to social distancing measures, whereas others did not. So this caused distress, especially for those who are clinically vulnerable. We identified that there needed to be clarity in messaging. But we also observed that there was a stark lack of thought for disabled people in our lives. We simply don't live in a culture where marginalized people are valued. Our struggles are neither heard nor understood. So non-disabled people do not think of us. We have felt that our lives are easily disposed of. And given the COVID death count, 6 out of 10 people who died from COVID were disabled, so we live it. In terms of social distancing, disabled people were antagonized. So for example, those who were exempt from wearing masks were overly questioned. At the same time, very little was done for other disabled people. So for example, we heard reports of blind people not being eligible for online delivery, but social distancing makes it difficult for them. So they struggle to social distance. In conclusion, the pandemic has exacerbated all the ways intersectional ableism exists. And the past year has been very difficult for us. So going forward, we need to work collectively to make demands from the government. And this is going to be difficult given the government. At the same time, we need to look at what is causing this extreme lack of care and thought from non-disabled people. Is it Brexit? Is it the effects of Tory policies, neoliberalism? I think we need to understand this. And finally, by working collectively, I mean cross-movement solidarity work with equality groups, such as LGBT groups and anti-racist groups, because disabled people are not homogeneous. That is, disabled experience is not universal, and different disabled women's voices need to be heard, for example, trans disabled women. So how we work together with other groups and what tactics we employ to enact policy change or important steps to think about, because it is quite unlikely that this government will listen to us. So how do we create change? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MSunnia, for that brilliant, kind of explanation of some of the findings of the research and the issues that it has raised. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear now from our panelists. We're going to hear their reflections on the report. So I'm going to introduce each panelist and then invite them to share briefly around their thoughts. So the first panelist that I would like to introduce, you've just heard from, is MSunnia. MSunnia, like I said, has done a brilliant job on this research, on this project, and is a queer crip feminist with a background in campaigns and organising. They are also the co-organiser of Criposium, which is a symposium on disability and intersectionality. We have, maybe people could turn on their cameras just as I introduce them. I hope that will work tech-wise, but then we can just, yeah. So MSunnia. We have Rachel O'Brien, who, like I said, is a member of the Sisters of Frida steering group. She works in public affairs for a disabled people's organisation and campaigns to improve the rights of disabled people. She's also a workplace rep for Unite the Union. So we will turn, yeah, if you could turn your cameras off, and I'm just going to introduce Dennis, if Dennis Queen is there. Dennis is a queer disabled musician based in Manchester. She's been involved in the disabled people's movement for over 20 years, which is huge, campaigning, performing and volunteering at disabled people's organisations, as well as being a panellist. As I mentioned, Dennis will perform a piece for us tonight. And I'm Tumu, I'm a Sisters of Frida steering group member as well. So I'm going to start by introducing Dennis. Are you okay to go first and share some of your reflections? So that's, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My reflections on the report, like dreadful but not surprising, I suppose, would be the summary from me. So sorry, I'm mixed Dennis Queen. My pronouns are she or anything. I'm a mother, a spouse, a musician and an activist. I am white, I am disabled, I'm bisexual and I'm in a queer family. I'm transgender, I'm genderqueer. This means I don't see myself as a man or woman, and I forgot to describe myself properly. I'm sporting a pink and blue short back and sides at the moment, and a polka dot shirt with a t-shirt underneath. So I don't see myself as a man or a woman, but I still face sexism because it affects everyone who isn't a man. And the pandemic for me as a disabled person it's led to all, it was seeing the report was very frustrating because it reflected the individual stories that we've been hearing right through the pandemic, and it's really important that these are studied further. I could tell you more about me and how I've been affected by those things, but I think for me, there's 3 or 4 main things that come out of this for me. So first of all was the avoidable carnage and how that's affected our communities. In March last year, in 2020, it was obvious that tens of thousands of people in institutions were likely to die. We, as a disabled people's movement, we were already organising around that knowledge. And the second thing is the statistics that are coming out from government. I feel like they won't deliberately tell us some of what we really want to know. Things like when they quote how many people who died were people of colour, and they quote how many people who died were disabled people, but they never ever give us the figure of everyone who was both. So we need more information, I think, and we need more intersectional information. And I feel that's being held back simply because we know that when we get those figures, they're going to be, you know, unconscionably high, I think the phrase is. I think the government needs to act to save our lives. That certainly reinforced that for me through supporting our cry for independent living. And I pray to Dan's memory that as soon as we can take to the streets about Free Our People, we are going to be doing that when everyone is, you know, when enough of us are vaccinated. I support all of Sisters of Frida's recommendations to government, and the only thing that I think hasn't been covered in much detail is the more sort of the harm and refuge, and I think I would very much like to see a few different kinds of refuges dotted around the UK that are accessible to all disabled people, but also everyone who isn't a woman, because there's big issues around the ability to escape for us when many of us may depend on those who harm us for our very lives. So I think that concludes everything I want to say, and just mainly I really want to see those statistics, and I want them analysed, and I support you in fighting for these demands, which I hope will be taken to government.
Thank you so much. Rachel, would you like to share next?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tumu. I'm Rachel O'Brien. I am a white woman with mid-length, long, somewhere in between, blonde hair, and I'm wearing a tiger print, black and orange jumper. So I think, having read the report, I think talking about independent living and like what this report has kind of discussed in relation to independent living is really important, because Sisters of Frida views independent living in its broadest sense. And while social care and personal assistance are important aspects of independent living, I think often they are viewed in basically to the exclusion of everything else. So there are 11 other pillars of independent living. So everything from transport to employment to sexuality. And we think it's incredibly important to consider all of these pillars so that all disabled people can fully participate in their communities. We've also concentrated, and this report concentrates on looking at independent living through an intersectional lens, focusing on the experiences and needs of multiply marginalised women. Necessarily, this includes looking at systems that disable women and limit their ability to live independently. And this includes things such as the criminal justice system and the hostile environment, looking at how normative gender roles interact with disableism. And whilst we've not maybe managed to do that all in this report, largely due to practical barriers like the lack of access to women living in prisons. One of the things that's come out of the pandemic is a lot of people who are currently imprisoned are effectively living in solitary confinement. You know, the government chose to go down that path rather than things around compassionate release or looking at like releasing people earlier, which has made actually accessing those groups of people in order to hear their views and think about how independent living affects them, like very difficult. But we hope by examining the experiences of a wide range of disabled women through an intersectional lens, we can start a process where we can broaden the disabled and the women's movement's understanding of independent living and adjust common visions of independent living so that all disabled people are able to have choice and control over their lives. So kind of as a result of this, and I think something that's really reflected very well in the report, is that we don't just need to break down disabling barriers. We must fight to end institutional and structural racism, sexism, and queerphobia in order to ensure that there is the possibility of independent living for all. I think quite often our various movements are siloed. You've got the disabled people's movement, you've got the women's movement, you've got the LGBT movement. various Black and ethnic minority movements. And it's quite often in the spaces in between where you hear the stories of those most marginalised and most in need of solidarity and liberation, and yet these are often the most kind of neglected portions of our movement. And I think this, like, MSunnia has done an amazing job at like beginning to draw all these things together. And so I'm we're really hopeful it's a start of something far bigger. And that thing is absolutely needed and necessary in order to achieve independent living as a goal for disabled people of all backgrounds. And that's me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Like hearing a thread kind of linking back to what MSunnia was saying about cross-movement solidarity, and kind of Dennis, you know, you mentioned wanting more statistics on people who are multiply marginalised, and the need to like broaden our kind of our understandings, and therefore our kind of how we're intervening in things and what we're doing. MSunnia, would you like to add your reflections as well at this point?
Yeah, so I think I think that I was right when I was writing this report. I was also looking back from 2008 onwards, and what has happened in terms of services for disabled people, but also the sense of the loss of rights of disabled people in the UK, and I guess state's attitude to this, and in finding the solution, the report has policy recommendations to the government and to various bodies. However, how that is done and how we work in getting sort of like getting our rights back. There were not a lot of rights, but there were some rights. And furthering those rights, I think that it's a complicated discussion to have, given the state of the government and how difficult it is to make that to make these arguments. And I would be quite interested to sort of hear from the other panelists and perhaps the attendees as well, in how to sort of like move forward from then on, because what has happened in the pandemic is the result of the culminating policies from 2008 onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, MSunnia, and hopefully that's something that we can explore a little bit more in the Q&A. And I guess just to kind of add, it's Tumu speaking, just to add kind of some of my reflections. I think something that really struck me was the finding that disabled women had become more reliant on partners and family members and friends, for example, in terms of like support needs, but also financial support. And I think it, you know, similar to what Dennis was raising around, like that can be very risky for us. And it just highlights how much of our experiences are invisibilized and not seen. So like the complexity and nuance, and I guess the richness of our lives in a way has been erased, you know, through narratives of like very categorized distinct groups. So there's like your vulnerable people, for example, but nothing with any more depth. And in a way, whilst on one hand, like this kind of patronizing idea of vulnerability has also hidden a lot of the need, because the need has just been associated with like a clinical, very medicalized understanding of like, yeah, what it is that's at risk, I guess. And the report found that you know, particularly like single, queer, disabled people, we're talking a lot about kind of feeling lonely and isolated, and you know, disabled mothers being expected to fulfill like normative gendered kind of parental roles, but with absolutely no support. And so how do we make sure that those stories and those experiences are kind of there for everyone to see? Because yeah, and I think there's a line in that, there's a part of the report that talks about like the lack of consideration for our lives, and how that's reflected in policy and decision making, and how people are feeling insecure and scared and abandoned. And ultimately there's a really, something that stood out for me and that was quite painful to read, I guess, is around how people felt that their lives were unworthy and disposable. And I think that has been a theme throughout, you know, from when this started to now. But equally, just acknowledging how long that's been the case, that's not a new thing, and how much of this report is speaking about things that already existed, and have been made worse. So I think there needs to be a lot more done to kind of explore the gendered experience of independent living for disabled women in the broadest terms, like Rachel mentioned, not just with a focus on care, personal care, for example, and, you know, thinking about multiply marginalized people, and yeah, how kind of organizations that are more well-resourced can support. So organizations who will describe themselves as feminist, as anti-racist, can work towards kind of furthering the work that we've started. And I guess my final reflection is just that in a lot of the conversations that we've had, and I've been in some of them, not all of them, there's already like a lot of knowledge, like we know that this stuff is happening, so we really need kind of more support to highlight it and do something about it, and that doesn't always fall on kind of smaller groups that consist of the people who might be at the real sharp end of this. Yeah, so I guess now, thank you so much, everyone. We're gonna kind of open the floor for a Q&A, and yeah, answer some of your questions, and just kind of open the floor so we can have a bit more of an informal conversation. So just want to invite the panelists to chip in wherever you want. I'm going to start off by asking a question, and then we can see where we go from there. So the first question is, why now? So why was this report, why was this project looked at now? What was kind of the motivating factor to do this work at this time?
Can I come in on that?
Absolutely.
So it's Rachel. I guess I spend a lot of time looking at like reports about disabled people, and like there's now been dozens of reports on like different aspects of how disabled people have experienced COVID. And one thing that has been missing is the kind of like understanding that not all disabled people will be affected in the same way by COVID. Some people will experience different things, some people will experience things more or less than others. And I feel like a gendered analysis has been incredibly lacking in all the reports I've read. So I think, yeah, like one of the things Sisters of Frida does really well is to kind of move into that space, which has been like traditionally neglected by, I guess, like mainstream women's and disabled people's organisations. And so this report was like incredibly timely and incredibly necessary in order to bridge the gap between these two different movements, in order to provide a greater understanding of the experiences of disabled women during the lockdowns, during the pandemic. And just to pick up on something, as I think Manish just said, around like, oh no, actually, sorry, Tumu said, around like vulnerability and like rhetoric around vulnerability, is there's been this kind of rhetoric powered by government, press, public bodies about how like disabled people with underlying health conditions are vulnerable to COVID-19. And I think, well, first of all, it's patronizing to call people vulnerable. I really hate that word. But also to describe a population as innately vulnerable to something, like depoliticizes the issue and makes it seem inevitable. And actually, this situation was never inevitable. It was in fact the minister that said that, like, you know, what happened during the pandemic was the years of, like, result of years and years of, like, policy decisions. And I saw it summed up really well on Twitter by, I think it was like a scientist at Imperial, who said that your susceptibility to something may be more biologically driven. You may be more susceptible to catching to having, like, ill effects of a virus, but your vulnerability to something is, like, socially and politically driven. It's the fact that actually we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough ventilators, housing in this country is incredibly poor, and there's certain parts of a population who are more likely to live in, like, overcrowded housing and have to work in the gig economy and things like that. And just, like, understanding the separation of those two things, susceptibility and vulnerability, moves the discussion away from, like, it being like an innate quality or an innate kind of like inevitability that there were the deaths, like the level of deaths there were, and, like, where the deaths were concentrated during the pandemic. And I think this report does just, like, tie into that, because, you know, we've talked about how disabled women in the report, how they've been more likely to lose jobs or have to take on additional caring responsibilities, or be more likely to face gendered violence. And I think, yeah, this report was incredibly necessary, incredibly timely to combating a lot of the rhetoric around kind of the inevitability of a situation which ended up happening.
Thank you, Rachel. A really important point about the rhetoric around vulnerability. And I guess to add to that, kind of this vulnerability rhetoric then kind of functioned to justify a lot of the medical responses, which were actually eugenicist in their very nature. You know, this salience of this idea of vulnerability then meant that when there weren't enough ventilators, that was the thing that was being looked at, this socially constructed idea, in order to decide who was being provided with healthcare. And as we know, disabled people are completely deprioritized for support across every aspect of kind of the healthcare system during the pandemic. Does anyone else want to comment on why now? So Rachel's given a real strong reasoning for, like, why it was, like, really needed and urgent. Does anyone else want to add to that? Sure.
Because it was, we needed this anyway in a lot of ways. I'm going to speak a little bit to the point about our history, I guess. And I absolutely agree that since 2008, we have seen a lot of the things that disabled people, many of them disabled women, in fact, fought for. We had seen if we go back to 2008, I was still protesting with the Disabled People's Direct Action Network, DAN. And that was, I think, the last year that we organised any sort of national action. Momentum had gone at this point because gradually we had stopped fighting as we had gained ground. I joined a shrinking movement in the late 90s. I didn't join in its heyday. So we were kind of facing a bit of it felt like we were trying to go the wrong way up a conveyor belt. And then and that was our last protest. We were warning of the cuts that would come in 2010. And in 2010 or around that time, when the cuts started to happen, we found that there was and between then and now, it's like they've been slowly dismantling everything that supports us, like the foundations. So they could be in a position now in 2020 and 2021 when they can create hospital policies that are absolutely eugenics and continue to do things that they know will lead to tens of thousands of deaths. And so this is not why, I suppose why, not why now, it's like because the time has absolutely come to start looking at how this affects disabled women in particular, because almost, and women, girls, and other gender non-conforming people like myself, how we are also affected, as that's never looked into. And I think, well, it's clearly really important. I think, you know, I think probably everyone here who has even just read the brief synopsis of the report here is that I think most of us can probably go down the list and say, oh yes, we experienced some of that, some of that, some of that. And I think that's very alarming. And I think maybe Sisters of Frida hopefully are going to lead the way here in encouraging others to think about the gendered aspects of what might be faced when we are doing other research, because there has been some other research, but a lot of it doesn't really look into how that affects us, those of us here. Hope that answers it.
Go ahead.
Yes, so I think that there's been a lot of discussion about gendered labour and feminist care, what feminist care looks like during the pandemic, but in feminist academia. However, it has consistently been lacking in terms of including disabled women and our understanding of care and our understanding of gendered labour. Gendered labour for disabled women is quite different. So I think that it was important to touch on that. I mean, the themes were coming out, so touching on that was quite important, because there are already research that has been released on women during the pandemic in terms of work, salary, and what it is to be at home. And the one thing that I also noticed in is that there, as I say, the disabled community is not homogeneous. We're quite complex. We're quite, there's multitudes of us. We're diverse, but the policies, policies in society don't cover that. They tend to be blanket policies. So I thought that this research it's apt to be right now, right here, when a lot of work are being produced, a lot of other reports are being produced on disability and on gender, and there are silences in these reports. And I think that our report also has a lot of silence, and I think we need to question that. We need to query that. We need to read through and say who is now represented there. There's a picture in the report about Sianda, who is a Black disabled woman who, prior to the pandemic, was arrested and imprisoned because she was trying to defend herself. She's a disabled Black woman who's trying to defend herself from racist attack. The police did not listen to her, nor investigate her issue, and she's in prison right now during COVID, and there's an appeal on her case. So Rachel was talking about, these women in prison. Like, I think it's important that we echo that, that there are a lot of silences, and these silences need to be sort of like looked at and looked into. And the same for refugee and asylum seekers, the conditions that they live in. We need to query all of that through the notion of disability justice. What is it that we mean by disability justice and disability care and independent living? And why are we not, as a disabled community, looking at this? Or why isn't the feminist community looking at that? I think feminist academia does, but not enough.
Thank you, MSunnia. Yes, a really important kind of, although our report might be better than others in some ways, really important to be critical of ourselves and remain curious and remain kind of in a position where we want to know more, and we want to, like you said, reach into like the things that aren't there, like that we haven't reported on, so the silences, and yeah, just echoing, kind of considering some of the people that you've mentioned, that Rachel mentioned, women in prison, refugee and asylum seeking women. We definitely need to do more. I just wanted to read out a comment from one of our attendees called Silvana, which I think links to this part of our discussion. So Silvana said that for some, in brackets, central government and supporters, bureaucracy is a useful tool to prevent action whilst appearing to be supportive, hence so many reports and regressive lived experience. We need to be aware of ploys like this so that we can force constructive change that improves our lived experience properly. And Silvana said that they're referring to commissioned reports, not ones like this that come from those that are affected. So thank you, Silvana, for that comment. So just to ask another question. So I was going to ask about why it's important to use an intersectional lens or analysis when looking at the experience of disabled women. I think you've spoken to that a little bit. So I'm going to ask a different question, a more specific question that we have. So how has the pandemic affected the lives of LGBT disabled women? Would anyone like to answer that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's a very difficult question, because from my experience, the queer community as a whole has, and that is not from, I'm not taking this from any data or any papers I've read or anything of that. That is from my perspective, my viewpoint, my narrative. So, and it's something that I keep saying to other queers. This I've never lived in such a hetero society, a very conservative society. Like this past year has been quite dystopian in terms of the focus on the family and what kind of family, and it's always almost the hetero family, the father, the mother, and the child, and certain portrayals of masculinity and strength in public that kind of upholds that kind of system of heteronormativity in society. So I think throughout the past year, the queer community has, like the disabled community, been fairly invisibilized by the pandemic. And I don't think there's enough out there that is actually looking at specifically disabled, like I haven't seen the specifically disabled queer women's experiences. I do know in terms of accessing healthcare for from the LGBT queer community, it has been difficult, especially like trans people have struggled a lot during this pandemic, and there has been a massive increase in terms of LGBT people kind of trying to seek and to get access to mental health support, and knowing how the mental health support is there's a huge demand, and there's a struggle to access these resources. So I think that more needs to be done on this, and I think I'll leave it as that. Yeah, it would be useful to hear from what the panelists other panelists have to say about this, but also, you know, the audience.
Thank you, MSunnia. I think that's a really important point about access to mental health care, and for different groups, and, you know, difficulty in accessing a service that is already, for example, transphobic. So yeah, kind of, I think it's really important to remember the context that we were in before. We were already, you know, people were already hugely struggling within our existing healthcare services, mental health care services, for example. And so trying to access already discriminatory contexts, but now with even less resource. So we've got 2 minutes left of this part of our evening, and I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to add a final comment before we have a comfort break. So does anyone have kind of a speedy last minute comment? We've got 2 people. Then would you like to go for it?
Dennis, you go for it.
Just to echo what MSunnia was saying, really, it's difficult to get a full overview, but the themes that I've seen amongst people I know have focused a lot around isolation, because there's a lot of people still living on their own, and access to healthcare, especially for young trans people who completely lost some of their healthcare during the pandemic. So yeah, healthcare has been a massive problem.
Yeah, I just wanted, I think Silvana's point, just going back a bit about like bureaucracy and like the constant commissioning of reports and audits by the government is like that. I like data as much as the next policy person, but there is a point at which reports are being produced for the sake of producing reports, and absolutely who is producing reports should be interrogated, and why are they producing a report rather than actually doing something. And I think like an excellent example of this is when the government's, I can't remember exactly what it's called, it was like race audit, or, you know, came out, and you know, it was horrific, right? For what, like, they knew they had to produce something, so they produced the most cynical and frankly in and of itself racist thing they could have done. And they did that to avoid actually doing anything that would make anyone's lives better. And I think we're at very real risk of this happening again with COVID, more specifically COVID and like the disproportionate impacts on particular demographics of people. And I think we need an inquiry, but there needs to be an inquiry that is not on the government's terms. There needs to be a public inquiry. It's the same piece of legislation that governs it as did the public inquiry like Grenfell, where actually it's independent of government. The government have done dozens of their own inquiries, like there's been like dozens of parliamentary inquiries and consultations, and I've submitted like throughout the last year dozens of responses. Nothing's changed, and like, you know, dozens of like hundreds of responses from other organisations. And I think we need a public inquiry, but the public inquiry can't be on the government's terms, and things need to be improving and things need to be changing in the meantime. So absolutely, I agree with Silvana's comment about bureaucracy basically being used as a means to like stop actually any material changes.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think that's kind of set the scene for the next part of this evening, where we're going to be talking more about what next steps are, what the future holds, what we can do together to translate some of these findings into action. So I'm going to honour the 10-minute break. I'm sorry that we're a couple of minutes over, but we will come back together at 7:32. So there's a 10-minute break now, so we'll come back together at 7:32. Thank you all so much. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your break. And just giving a moment to make sure all the panelists have managed to come back. Hey, we've got some waves from people. Okay. Yeah, so much to think about during that break. My mind has a lot of different thoughts. Very grateful for such a rich discussion so far. And I think that the sentiment around moving from kind of moving into action, so thinking about how we can move forward and together make change, what happens, what needs to happen next, has been highlighted as a really important conversation. So this next part, we are going to focus on that. So the question for the panel is, what do we want to see happen next? And do you have any further comments around this? And again, I'd just like to invite anyone to chip in and share their thoughts. You know, sometimes these things aren't fully formulated yet, and that's okay. This is also a space for us to imagine. But yeah, what do we need to happen next? What do we want to see? Do any of the panelists, would anyone like to go first? I've made a mistake in the agenda. I'm so sorry. Would we like to, should we do the discussion first, or should we have a song from Dennis? So apologies, Dennis. I mixed up the order. What should we do? Does anyone have thoughts? MSunnia?
I think, should we ask Dennis what they're happy with, and then...
Is Dennis there?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't mind, but I think the song I'm going to do is the kind of the answer to that question for me. Because I've been thinking about what are we going to do since the pandemic hit. So I can either do that before or at the end. It might be nice to give other voices space first. So I really don't mind.
It might be nice to open the discussion with a song. That's a different way to do things. Would you be up for that? Should we open our, if it is kind of feels quite related, yeah? Is that all right? Thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, I'd like to introduce Dennis. Thank you so much.
Long live our movements while we must fight. Long may we resist what is wrong for what's right, till all our descendants can live in the light, not locked behind doors, out of range, out of sight. No, the cause of oppression's not inside me or you, our bodies or minds or our senses, it's not true. Let's fight for change till the world is for you, for me and for all who come after us too. All now, pull together, find those who are missing, so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, but there's further to go. Let our shared experiences generate change. Leave nothing undone, fight in all of our ways. Leave no one behind, use well all of our days, till we pass over and go to our graves. These times once again are becoming so tough. These social distances feel pretty rough. The carnage our people face is more than enough. We'll rise again soon for justice with love. All now pull together, find those who are missing so that they may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, but there's further to go. On to your dream of a bigger new world, where we all belong and are seen and are heard. Keep that vision growing, invite others in. The more we come together, the more we will win. Remember activists gone before us, powerful traditions entrusted to us. Tell radical stories so no knowledge is lost. Our emancipation is waiting for us. All now pull together, find those who are missing so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, but there's further to go. All now pull together, find those who are missing so that we may grow. Even now, it's just the beginning. We've come so far, but there's further to go.
Thank you so much. I'm sending you a virtual round of applause. It's such a shame that we're not in person, but thank you for such an uplifting call to action and solidarity. I feel very hopeful after that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's definitely a great opening for this discussion. Thank you. And so on that note, what do we want next? What do we want to see happen? Do any of the panelists? Okay, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think ultimately the pandemic exacerbated a lot of issues. It did not create the issues. The issues and the oppression and marginalization were always there, and the pandemic shone a light on them and made them a lot worse, but it didn't create them. So I think actually to concentrate purely on the pandemic would be a mistake. We need to look at all the things that led up to the pandemic and see how things can change, because actually, I mean, the sad truth is that this is not going to be the last pandemic, right? We live in a state of like environmental and climate disaster. And so I think we do need, I agree with what Dennis said earlier about like disaggregated data and like actually having the data we need in order to understand the issues, but it can't stop at data collection. It needs to manifest into real tangible change. So I think actually there are a lot of like organizations out there calling for independent inquiry. I know the Trade Union Congress is, as well as lots of other organizations. And I think getting behind that is really important. But again, as I said, independent like inquiry on our terms and like making sure the terms of reference actually include the needs and experiences of marginalized people, and most importantly, like multiply marginalized people, to ensure that like people aren't left out of the solutions going forward.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I guess when you were talking about kind of the need for disaggregated data and kind of making sure that experiences don't get left out, I guess I was reflecting on the real fact is that this project was kind of born out of a bit of a disappointment, I'd say, certainly from my point of view, in our kind of inability to get funding, larger pieces of funding, for a larger project relating to disabled women and independent living. And I think there is a sense from some people, myself included, that kind of the urgent need to look and act on this is not there, or it's not in the minds of a lot of organizations, perhaps. I think it speaks to what somebody mentioned earlier, you know, you might have feminist organizations over there dealing with certain things, and anti-racist movements over there dealing with certain things, and the disabled movement, and it can all feel quite separate at times. So yeah, I think like it's really important for for this type of research and for this type of work to be funded and to be acknowledged by funders and by organizations who are saying that they want to do this work, but then perhaps not giving enough opportunity to groups of people who have lived experience, or who are able to, or who are in community with people that we want to speak to and that we want to hear from. So I just kind of wanted to point that out as well. Does anyone else have any ideas that they'd like to share? I'm wondering, is there a possibility, if anybody from the audience would like to share in the Q&A, anything that they'd like to comment around next steps, or questions around next steps? And I'll just give that a minute, and if not, we also, I guess we do have some next steps from our point of view as Sisters of Frida, but it would be nice to hear from anyone who would like to contribute. Go for it. Yeah, hi Dennis.
Hi. I feel like the kind of maybe the obvious next step is to see at least what we can do in terms of getting maybe other organisations, women's organisations and disabled people's organisations, to support the recommendations that you're making, and perhaps get back your campaign in that sense. Do you think that's something that we can do, like within some of the other groups many of us are involved in? Thanks, Tumu.
Yeah, I mean, from my personal perspective, definitely, I think it speaks to like what MSunnia was saying about cross movement solidarity, and I guess like, yeah, perhaps feeling like in a lot of spaces, like there is kind of a little bit sometimes of a single issue focus, or perhaps certain experiences might be thought about, but again, like we've said throughout this event this evening, it's not rich enough, there's not enough depth. We need to constantly be making it more complex, because it is complex, and kind of really making room for real lives and real people's experiences, and that includes the nuance and the richness, and that we're not a homogenous group, and that any feminist space should also be addressing ableism, should be thinking about the experiences of disabled women and gender non-conforming people in everything they do, and that's not always the case, I don't think. So yeah, I think partnering with other organizations, make kind of really solidarity in this work, and working with various groups would be really, really important. That's my personal view. I wonder, does anyone else have anything to add before we move on?
There's some stuff in the Q&A to me.
Okay, brilliant. Is anyone able to read that out? Or would you like me to? I'm not sure if I can see it.
Yeah, I can. So Louise says, how can we all work together to campaign for funding for organisations led by disabled people? Someone else says, in terms of what needs to happen next, I wonder if a panel has any thoughts on nuance to the discourse about everyone vaccinated equals back to normal life. there's still quite a lot of concerns that vaccination might not actually be as efficient on people with certain conditions or taking certain medication. And Tiandi says, I think we must get together internationally. I guess, like, yeah, just picking up on that last one, I think that's incredibly important, because due to a number of factors, largely still money, this report does concentrate on the experiences of women in the UK. But we know across the world, like, you know, this has been a global pandemic, and the impact of it has not been like equally felt across the world. And we can see that even now, when vaccine patents still aren't being gotten rid of, so that countries in the global south can produce their own vaccines rather than having to like pay exorbitant amounts to vaccine manufacturers. And that's an injustice in and of itself. But on a more kind of self-interested note, if we don't sort the pandemic out globally, well, everyone around the world will continue to experience the effects of it. So I think international solidarity, especially when our government is so complicit in like vaccine patents, is like incredibly important as well.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, so I really like, and I really agree with Rachel's comment on vaccine for people, vaccine justice, especially for the global south. When you look at how many people are being vaccinated in European, American, North American countries in comparison to the global south, it's I mean, the stark injustice can be felt. I think equally Canada and other countries, other Western countries, I think the US and the UK, I can't remember exactly what other European countries are sitting on a lot of vaccines that they don't need to. There is a vaccine surplus in the West, and that is just selfishness and greed and waste, and that is quite uncalled for. Yes, I do agree, Elsin. I know no one is supposed to pay for COVID vaccine. The other questions have disappeared.
That's okay. We're quite close to time, so yeah.
Okay.
Is that okay if we slowly start to kind of move on a little bit? I think that it's
Yeah.
and I think as well, like just thinking about the things that are gonna get in the way of us. For example, the police crime and sentencing bill, which will criminalize protest. You know, how are we going to challenge things if we're not allowed to protest, if we're not legally allowed to gather and resist? So things like Kill the Bill are very, I think, connected to our struggles here. So yeah, Rachel and I are going to just share some of the kind of suggestions from Sisters of Frida for the next steps. And obviously they're not exhaustive, like we know that there'll be like lots and lots of ideas amongst all of us, but some of the ones that we wanted to share. So we just really hope that we think that we need to continue to raise the voices of disabled women on this issue. So this work is really just a starting point. It's the beginning. And it is kind of the beginning of a strand of work, hopefully. So something that will spark a lot more to come. And we think that it's important to work with equalities organisations, again, to build a cross-movement, to build cross-movement work that specifically looks at the inequalities of this pandemic and what it's exacerbated. And we also would like to take the report to funders to kind of illustrate the issue further, so to make it explicit, and to lobby for further funding on disabled women and independent living in whatever kind of area that needs to be done. So yeah, Rachel, would you like to add some suggestions as well?
Yeah, so we're also going to continue pushing for like visions and ideas around all 12 pillars of independent living, rather than resorting to just a narrow definition of independent living that focuses on personal assistance and social care, because actually for many disabled women, it's the systems under which they live is restricting their choice and control, as well as often the lack of personal assistance available to them. We'll also continue pushing for the disabled people's movement to take a gendered and intersectional analysis to their work, to actually ensure that their work does reflect the needs and interests of all disabled people, rather than like often defaulting to like a white male perspective that doesn't actually meet the needs of multiply marginalised disabled people. And we want to work with decision makers and collaborate and co-produce on solutions to the issues we've identified in the report as well, so that hopefully we can start to make change to ensure that disabled women can live independently.
Thank you. And just to add, we did have a question on kind of how to make social justice movements more intersectional in their approach instead of focusing on single issue, and I mentioned that, you know, they're often kind of siloed and splintered, and that was from Priscilla. So I guess the how is still up for debate, and I mean there's lots of people working tirelessly for this already, but you know, we're so interested in hearing from everyone and hope that you'll get more involved with us in the future in thinking about ways that we can go forward and practical ways. And so there's a couple of things that we need to share with you. So I might ask the others as well, because I'm not entirely sure, but we have some video testimonies, some videos from people who have also contributed to this research project, speaking about their experiences that we're going to release after this event. Does anyone have a date for that, or is that yet to be confirmed?
Yet to be confirmed, will be soon.
But they're really amazing, so yeah, look out for those, and we'll definitely announce it on our social media and our website, and then also the report itself. So the kind of the thing that's brought us together this evening, when will people be able to look at the report?
It will be uploaded onto the website following the end of this webinar, and we'll make sure to put it on our socials, so keep an eye out for it.
Thank you so much. So they're the two things yet to come. So the report itself, which you'll be able to read, and also video contributions generously provided by people offering their thoughts and perspectives to the research. So time has flown, and the only thing left is to thank you all for generously spending your evening with us. So I just want to thank everyone that's attended tonight. It's, you know, we're over the moon that so many of you wanted to spend time with us and listen to our thoughts and contribute. I'd like to thank our brilliant panellists. So MSunnia, a special shout out to you because of all the work you've done on this as a researcher. It's invaluable. Rachel, Dennis, you've been incredible as well, and just sending extra good vibes to Martha, who couldn't join us. I want to mention Alice, who's been the project coordinator, who's done loads of behind the scenes work and has been massively helpful. The Sisters of Frida steering group, and the Smallwood Trust and National Lottery for funding our projects. And lastly, and by no means least,